July 1st, 1901. On the quiet island of Rügen in northern Germany, the people of Göhren live simple, predictable lives. It's the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and nothing ever seems to change. Until that summer afternoon. 6-year-old Peter Stuber and his 8-year-old brother Hermann wander off to play near the woods outside the village. Like they've done many times before, they plan to pick some blackberries to bring back home. But by the time dinner is served by their parents, the boys have still not returned. Their parents search the lanes, the fields, the forest trails, but there's no sign of the boys. So alongside several neighbours and even a local policeman from their village, they head out with lanterns and torches. When they still fail to find them, they formally report them as missing, and a large group of volunteers gathers to begin searching the area. Everyone is confident the two boys have just wandered off and gotten lost in the dark. Nobody even suggests something worse may have happened to them. But by the next morning, it becomes clear that they couldn't have been more wrong. In the nearby forest, a neighbour helping search for the boys stumbles across a scene that's like something straight out of a nightmare. Both boys had been brutally murdered, with their killer dismembering them and leaving a mess of organs and body parts scattered over a 500-metre area of the forest. Peter's skull had been crushed, his neck had been severed at the spine, his intestines had been pulled out of his stomach, and his heart had been removed. Hermann's body had been cut in half, with his legs being found far away from his torso. Even more disturbingly, his heart had also been removed, and it was nowhere to be seen. What was done with it would never be known, because his heart would never be found. The scene reminds the villagers of something that happened a few weeks earlier. A number of sheep had been discovered slaughtered and dismembered at a nearby pasture, their remains scattered everywhere. There had been whispers that either witchcraft rituals or some sort of supernatural monster like a werewolf were responsible. So to the villagers, it seems like whoever or whatever was behind those animal attacks must also be behind this new, even more sickening crime. Rügen, and northern Pomerania more broadly, was one of the most tradition-heavy regions of Imperial Germany at the turn of the century. In the 1800s, Mecklenburg and Pomerania were known for their rich oral folklore. Witches, werewolves, and forest spirits featured heavily in local tales, surviving far longer here than in Germany's more industrialized regions. The area was often described as one of the last strongholds of rural superstition. Even contemporary German newspapers sometimes use the term Werwolfmörder, werewolf murderer, for extremely brutal killers. So local superstition after a child murder like this was commonplace among the villagers. But the police do not take these claims of witches and werewolves seriously. Instead, as they begin investigating who could have done this to the two innocent children, they discover a single witness who claims to have seen the boys chatting with a man on the afternoon that they disappeared. A man that he recognized. A local carpenter called Ludwig Tessnow. Finding him on a beach near Binz, investigators question where he was last night. But he calmly tells them he'd been working at home all day and that they have the wrong man. They almost believe him, until they begin searching his home and discover something extremely unsettling. In his house, they quickly locate damp clothing that's been recently washed, and it's still covered in dark stains that look unnervingly like blood. They then discover a pair of heavily stained boots that he'd clearly tried and failed to scrub clean too. Ludwig denies that he'd been cleaning off bloodstains. Instead, he tells them that the dark marks are the result of wood dye and varnish that had splashed on his clothes during his work. Not believing him, the officers arrest him, certain he's their killer. Yet Ludwig seems calm and rational. Could such a man really be responsible for such extreme and gruesome violence? And if he was behind the attack, local residents can't help but question. Had they caught a killer? Or had they caught something much, much worse? To find out what really happened, the detectives are forced to seek the assistance of a young scientist whose breakthrough experiments would not only uncover the truth, but would change the course of forensic criminology forever. This isn't just the story of serial killer Ludwig Tessnow, the Mad Carpenter. It's the origin story of modern forensic science itself. This is the story of the Rügen Ripper. After his arrest, Ludwig was initially held in a shed at the Binz fire department, where the police arranged a carriage to transport him to a train station. Along the way, large crowds gathered, wanting vigilante justice for the horrific murders of the Stuber boys. resulting in clashes with the escorting police officers. When they eventually managed to get Ludwig to a prison in Greifswald, they began their formal interrogation. Yet as they questioned him, Ludwig remained adamant that they had the wrong man, and that the red stains on his clothes really were from Carpenter's varnish. He almost seemed believable, making them question if they'd made a mistake. But then, as they began looking into Ludwig's past, they discovered a chilling revelation that completely changed how they looked at him. Because Ludwig wasn't some ordinary workman who'd suddenly snapped. His story went back decades, to a childhood marked by violence, poverty, and instability. And the more investigators learned about where he came from and what he'd previously been accused of, the clearer it became that the quiet carpenter from Rügen was hiding a dark secret, a dark monster inside of him. Ludwig Tessnow was born in February 1872 in the small Prussian village of Stolzenhagen near Stettin, now Szczecin in Poland. His life began under difficult circumstances. He was the illegitimate child of a mother who suffered from epilepsy and a father known locally for his heavy drinking and his violent temper. Violence, in fact, ran through the family. One of his half-brothers had been imprisoned for manslaughter and later took his own life behind bars. Another relative, potentially his father, though it's a little unclear, was prosecuted for a knife attack after a brawl. When Ludwig's mother later married a man named Friedrich Ludwig Tessnow, the child took his stepfather's name. But the marriage was short-lived. Her new husband also drank heavily, and it wasn't long before the home broke apart again. As a young man, Ludwig trained as a carpenter, a common trade in the villages of northern Germany. But his early adulthood was already marked by instability. Police records show he had multiple convictions for theft, burglary, and begging during this time. He drifted from workshop to workshop, never staying long, taking seasonal work where he could. As the investigators traced his movements through old police files, they began to see a pattern, a trail of petty crimes and unexplained violence that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Within those archives was one case in particular that made their blood run cold. It suggested that the murders on Rügen weren't the first time Ludwig had been suspected of killing children. It might simply have been the first time anyone could prove it. Because just 3 years earlier, Ludwig had been the main suspect in an uncannily similar murder investigation, one where 2 young girls were found butchered and dismembered in a forest near Lecting. 3 years before the tragedy on Rügen, another small community just outside Osnabrück in northwestern Germany faced a nightmare of its own. On the morning of September 9, 1898, 2 7-year-old girls, Elsa Langemeyer and Hannelore Heidmann, left for school like they did every other day. Yet, on this occasion, they never arrived. This prompted a huge search effort spearheaded by their parents. But the 2 girls couldn't be found anywhere in the village. By evening, the search had expanded to the nearby forests, and to the horror of the volunteers, they soon stumbled across the mutilated and dismembered body of Hannelore. Much like the murders of the Stuber brothers, she had been savagely broken and torn apart, and her body pieces were scattered around a vast area. A few hours later, they discovered Elsa's body in the same forest, having suffered the same unimaginable fate. As police began their investigation, interviewing everyone in the village, a witness told them they had seen Ludwig walking out of the forest and into the village on the day the 2 girls were killed. The same witness claimed that Ludwig's clothes looked like they were heavily stained with something dark that resembled blood. Police rushed to arrest Ludwig, finding him still wearing the stained clothes. Yet he quickly explained the marks away as being wood dye from a carpentry job, claiming he'd been returning from work when he was spotted near the woods. In 1898, forensic science was in its infancy, and to the naked eye, there was no way to distinguish a dried bloodstain from a splash of dark dye. The investigators were powerless to refute his claim. As police interrogated him, Ludwig showed no signs of anxiety, and police felt he appeared rational and sound, not like the type of person who could have committed such extreme violence only hours earlier. Although they did find a button in the forest near one of the crime scenes that matched those on Ludwig's suit, Ludwig claimed it had been lost weeks earlier, and they ultimately released him, believing his claim about the wood dye and having no other evidence linking him to the murders. While it might seem strange to us that they let him go, it's worth remembering that at the time, the prevailing belief was that only someone with a severe mental illness could commit such horrific acts of murder. So the fact that Ludwig was calm, rational, and realistically seemed normal to them essentially cleared him of suspicion. Supposedly, In the weeks after the murders, Ludwig was frequently seen around the village wearing the same stained clothes. He'd made no attempt to clean them, which perhaps makes sense if the stains really were wood dye. But if they were blood from the girls, the levels of arrogance and depravity are almost unbelievable. He was literally walking around the relatives of his victims, covered in their blood, mocking them. Not long after, Ludwig packed his tools and moved on, leaving behind a grieving, terrified village and a crime that seemed destined to remain unsolved. By 1901, he'd drifted to Rügen, Germany's largest island, working as a carpenter and handyman with a master carpenter named Schmidt in the seaside village of Barbe, which was just a short walk from Göhren. Locals described him as quiet, shy even, but said his moods changed without warning. Some days he was polite and sober, others, he was withdrawn and drinking heavily. But nobody in his new village had any idea about his alleged involvement in the murder of the two young girls. That same year, he came to the attention of the police several times. In March of 1901, a young woman named Berta Lau, near the town of Pribbenau, was attacked on a country path but managed to fight off her assailant. Ludwig was briefly arrested in connection with the attack but later released for lack of proof. A few months later, farmers near Barber reported a string of sheep mutilations, animals found ripped apart in their fields. When shown a lineup, one farmer picked out Ludwig as the man he'd seen loitering near his flock. But none of it led to charges. Ludwig returned to his workbench, carving joints and varnishing boards, and went largely unnoticed in the small coastal community. And it was not long after that the two young brothers vanished while out picking blackberries. And once again, the quiet carpenter's name would come up. With evidence linking him to two uncomfortably similar crimes, the police now had no doubt that Ludwig was their killer. But whereas last time there had been no way to prove that his claims about the stains on his clothes weren't true, this time there was. It had been a real problem for investigators in the past to prove that bloodstains belonged to a victim. Without the sort of technology we have nowadays, it wasn't uncommon for killers to claim any stains or blood had come from animals, not humans. The result of cutting up an animal for food, of hunting, of anything but murder, and police had no way to prove otherwise. But that all changed in February 1901, just 5 months before the murder of the two brothers, thanks to a scientist at the University of Greifswald called Paul Uhlenhuth. Uhlenhuth had developed a test capable of distinguishing between human blood and animal blood, revolutionizing forensic investigations forever. The new test worked through the antigen-antibody reaction. By injecting an animal, such as a rabbit, with another animal's blood, such as a human, their immune systems would produce antibodies against the foreign proteins, called precipitins. When blood from this rabbit was then processed into a serum and mixed with diluted human blood, the mixture would visibly clump together. But if it was mixed with any other kind of blood, nothing would happen. The implication was profound. This method could easily differentiate the blood of different species. In early 1901, he had reported that he could distinguish cow blood from that of horses, sheep, dogs, and critically, humans. This test had never been used in a criminal case before, but following discussions between the local prosecutor, Ernst Hubschmann, and the examining magistrate, it was decided to enlist Uhlenhuth's expertise to perform forensic analysis on the clothing and footwear recovered from Ludwig's home. Uhlenhuth personally handled the evidence and the testing to see if the stains on Ludwig's clothes were wood dye or human blood, with multiple stains across his clothing requiring multiple tests. While he was able to confirm that some of the stains were indeed wood dye as Ludwig had claimed, the vast majority of them were undeniably human blood. His tests found human blood on 6 different areas of Ludwig's coat, 7 spots on his trousers, 4 locations on his waistcoat, and once on both his cap and his vest. As well as human blood, he also found traces of sheep's blood on Ludwig's jacket and trousers, which essentially confirmed that Ludwig had not only killed the Stuber brothers, but that he'd also been responsible for the mutilated sheep found a couple of weeks before their murders. While technology at the time didn't enable them to confirm exactly whose blood was on Ludwig's clothing, it was deemed strong enough evidence to charge him with murder. For the first time in history, science had linked a suspect to a murder through species-specific blood testing. The story made front-page news across Germany, with the press dubbing it Der Blutprobefall, the blood test case. And by the summer of 1902, the trial for the Monster of Rügen was set to begin. Although the prosecution believed the evidence overwhelmingly proved Ludwig's guilt in the murders of the Stuber brothers, what was less obvious was whether he could be held mentally responsible for them. After all, what kind of person rips children limb from limb and scatters their remains over hundreds of feet? And for what possible purpose, other than madness? Ludwig had been sent to the Ueckermünder sanatorium for months to be observed. During his time there, 6 separate psychiatrists examined him independently, and all of them concluded that he was not mentally accountable at the time of the killings. They discovered that Ludwig had spent hours at the crime scenes after the murders, moving body parts around. They argued that a rational killer would have tried to cover his tracks and flee, leading them to believe that Ludwig was insane and must suffer from some sort of severe mental illness. In contrast, Uhlenhuth served as the chief prosecution witness, testifying about his findings that contradicted Ludwig's claims that the stains on his clothing were from wood dye. The defense tried to undermine him, calling the test unproven and experimental. They argued that coincidence, not science, was being dressed up as certainty. But the data was clear, the method sound, and the results reproducible. Despite the claims of insanity and mental illness, the prosecutor dismissed the psychiatric reports and urged the jury to convict Ludwig without hesitation to ensure this monster would be removed from society. The jury agreed, and on December 14, 1902, Ludwig was found guilty of the murders of Hermann and Peter Stuber and sentenced to death by guillotine. That was in spite of the fact that the law prohibited capital punishment in cases of diminished mental capacity. This led to outrage among the psychiatric community, who questioned why they'd been consulted at all if their findings were just going to be ignored. Ludwig's execution was scheduled for October 17, 1903 at Greifswald prison. But the night before, he suffered a violent seizure and lost consciousness. As a result, he was transferred to the Greifswald Mental Hospital, with his execution postponed. While there, his defense opened an appeal, citing his apparent mental illness, and succeeded in getting his case reopened. At his second trial, the same debate between psychiatric experts and the prosecution played out, with the defense fighting for Ludwig to be deemed not mentally responsible and thus unable to be executed. However, the jury ultimately reached the same conclusion as they did in the first trial, sentencing Ludwig to death again. Newspapers at the time, such as the Berlin Der Tag, supported the verdict, claiming it didn't matter if he was sane or not, he needed to be killed for his crimes. Ludwig was then beheaded in 1904 in the courtyard of Greifswald prison. At least that's the typical ending to this story that's been told for over 100 years. But it might not actually be true. There are actually no documents or judicial files that exist regarding Ludwig's execution. Given that the case was fairly high profile at the time, this has always led some historians to question if it actually happened or not. But if Ludwig wasn't executed, then what exactly did happen to him after he was found guilty? The answer might not be what you're expecting. Because in 2016, forensic psychiatrist Jan Armbruster claimed that he'd uncovered the truth in some old hospital archives while he was researching the case. He found documents stating that Ludwig's sentence was actually quietly commuted from death to life imprisonment, and this claim was backed up by historian Andreas Albers and a number of German criminologists who looked over the findings. Among the newly unearthed documents, files from the Stralsund State Mental Hospital were discovered that stated definitively that Ludwig was transferred to a highly secure wing of the facility in 1913, a decade after he was said to have been executed. These same files showed that Ludwig remained in the hospital until 1939, listed as an uncured patient. That November, the hospital was then cleared out as part of the Nazis' Action T4 euthanasia program, a state-sponsored mass killing of the mentally and chronically ill. According to the files, 300 of the hospital's mentally ill patients were taken to Poland and executed by the SS in what is now known as the Piaśnica massacre, and Ludwig was among them. If this is true, Ludwig, a monstrous killer who terrified the public, may have ultimately met his fate at the hands of a far larger, more methodical, and even more incomprehensible machine of death. While Ludwig's story faded into obscurity, Paul Uhlenhuth's discovery changed forensic science forever. His precipitin method, the first test that could tell human blood from animal blood, was officially adopted as court-admissible evidence in Prussia in 1903, barely a year after Ludwig's conviction. Within a decade, laboratories across Europe were using it in thousands of criminal cases. For the first time, investigators could separate truth from lies and know, beyond words and excuses, what kind of blood they were actually looking at. It soon expanded beyond blood, to hair, tissue, and other bodily fluids. And by the 1920s, forensic institutes had standard operating manuals derived directly from Uhlenhuth's test. Decades later, when DNA profiling emerged, scientists cited his work as its conceptual ancestor, the first successful attempt to link evidence directly to a person through biology. For students of forensics, Ludwig's case remains the origin point, giving it an unexpected legacy in the pages of criminal history. But Uhlenhuth's own story didn't remain untarnished. During the Nazi era, he served in the regime's medical administration, helping remove Jewish scientists from their posts and proposing unethical immunization experiments on prisoners. So ultimately, the same mind that used science to advance forensics to help apprehend the guilty later misused it to aid one of history's darkest regimes in abusing and experimenting on the innocent. And that duality between knowledge and cruelty, progress and corruption, runs through this whole case. In 1901, villagers in Rügen still whispered about werewolves and dark magic after the Stuber brothers' deaths. The idea that a normal man could dismember animals and children with such savagery felt impossible to them. Yet at the very same moment, Germany's courts were beginning to replace superstition with science and belief with proof. For centuries, killers accused of similarly savage crimes across Europe had almost always been labelled as werewolves or other supernatural beings. But now, psychologists could finally explain what sort of human being could commit these unspeakable acts. Ludwig's case stands exactly at these various crossroads. When science and medical knowledge, the ability to understand mental illness, to identify a killer by forensic tests, was speaking with authority in court. Yet it was still butting heads with centuries of outdated superstitious beliefs and misunderstandings about the human mind. In the end, the story of Ludwig Tessnow isn't only about a killer. It's about a world on the edge of change, caught between folklore and forensics, between faith and fact. Ludwig himself disappeared into history, consumed by something even more evil than himself. But the stain that exposed him never really faded. Instead, it became a symbol of the moment the microscope learned to speak, and the dead finally began to speak back to it. And because of that first test, and everything it set in motion, countless victims since have been given a voice, and a chance at justice. And with that, our exploration of this historic true crime case comes to a close. As always, thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to do all the things the mighty algorithm gods desire of you. You know, like and subscribe, drop a comment, sacrifice a goat, all the usual stuff. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked down in the description as well. They're both really just gestures of support right now, though if you join either, you do get to see your name at the end of my videos, alongside all the lovely people popping up on screen in a few seconds. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.